Thank you. It's lovely to be here with you all. And it's also lovely to be here with the people who are watching on live stream Facebook. I thought it would be nice to say hello to them. So if those of you who are in these rows, can you all just turn around and wave all together and we'll say hi. Sorry, I hope everyone on Facebook feels as welcome as everyone here. Christine was very generous in her description of my next book. What she ought to have said was that the plan was that the book would have been available here at the Festival of Preaching. The problem with that is books need to be available once they've been written. And since it hasn't yet been written, it was difficult to make it available. But now I finally know what it is that I want to say, and one of the things that I'm going to be doing this morning is sharing with you some of the ideas that I've been exploring while I've been working out what I would say when I got round to writing the book. So I'll then start in a bit. The other thing that I just want to say to you, and can we have the slides up on the screens, please, is that often what happens when you're asked to do a talk like this is that months and months and months in advance, the organisers rightly write to you and say, can you give us a title for your talk? At which point you go, oh, something like, and so the something like that I came up with was Preaching the Parables. Once I actually sat down to write the talk, I realised I didn't want to write that talk anymore, and I wanted to write something else. So you will see that I've subtly changed the title to Preaching and the Parables. So it's still about preaching, it's still about parables, but it's not about preaching the parables. And the reason why it's not about preaching the parables is actually that's one of the trickiest bits about engaging with the parables. I think preaching parables is a little bit like explaining a joke. You know, in a way, the parables stand for themselves, and the minute you start explaining what they're about, you kind of spoil them. And therefore, I didn't want to spend a whole talk talking to you about something that I think makes the parables worse rather than better. So instead, what I thought would be more fun would be to talk to you about what we might learn from the parables for our own preaching. Given that parables were so important for Jesus' teaching, actually what we might learn from that as we begin to reflect on what skills we use in preaching. So hence I changed the title with the important word "and" to Preaching and the Parables. So let's begin by reflecting, therefore, a little bit on what we can learn from Jesus' own teaching in the parables. I think the first thing to note is this, that there is a case to be made for parables being the most characteristic feature of Jesus' teaching. The minute I say that, the other half of my brain goes, oh, steady on with your bold statements about characteristic features of Jesus' teaching. There's a case to be made for it. I might disagree with myself having made the case, but I think there is something actually important about making that case. You will have noticed, I'm sure, that one of the really striking things about Jesus' teaching is that it's really difficult to find anything that looks like what we would think a sermon was. You will know, of course, that there is something called a sermon in the Gospels, the Sermon on the Mount. But can I gently suggest to you that you don't preach a sermon that looks exactly like the Sermon on the Mount? I don't think it would work very well as a sermon, because as you will know, it's a collection of teachings, it's a collection of sayings, some of which go together, others not so much. And actually, as a structure, as a tool of engagement, as a tool of communication, it's not the best example of how you might go about doing this. So, how do we then begin to understand features of Jesus' teachings? If you have a look through the Gospels, you'll discover three intriguing things, I think, about Jesus' teaching. There are lots of short aphorisms, those little landing phrases. You know, the Sabbath wasn't made for the Son of Man wasn't made for the Sabbath. I can never get that one the right way round. But the Son of Man for the Sabbath, those kind of things, the little short snappy things, which are not very long statements, they're just short aphorisms. Jesus, as I'm sure you know, loves questions. Question after question after question, and his most clever thing whenever asked a difficult question is that he answers it with a difficult question. classy move, I always think. So recognizing that questions is important. But the third, and this is why I want to make the case for parables, is that there is something about parables which seems to characterize particularly how Jesus taught, how Jesus communicated, how he began to engage people. Now here's an interesting thing which fascinates me, is that when you have a look at books on parables, there are a few exceptions, but most books on parables cherry pick your parables. So you will have books that have about 15 parables in them. And from that, people begin to work towards a definition of parables. We're coming on to definitions of parables in a moment. But for me, the really interesting thing is actually taking a step back and saying, well, what if we look at the broadest extent of parables? And here's a little trivia quiz for you for the morning. How many parables in total did Jesus talk about? Anyone a number? So what was that? 32. I love that very precise number. Fabulous. No, not 32. Any advance on 32? I think I heard 60. It's in the region of 60, and by 60 I mean different ones. So you could go larger if you count the parable of the lost sheep twice in Matthew and Luke. I've not. These are just the unique parables of Jesus. Around 60 of them. And that's really interesting. Of course, it all depends how you define a parable. I was having dinner with a friend recently, and I told her I was writing a book on the parables. And I said, and I thought it'd be really interesting to go wider and have a look at John's Gospel and use the I am sayings as well. And she said, yeah, but they're not parables. And I went, why not? And she said, because they're not stories. At which point I went, it all depends how you define parables. So hold that in your mind for a moment. I'm going kind of maximal understanding of parables, which is images. Images that Jesus uses in order to explore points. You're very welcome to disagree with me later, but just have a think about those kinds of things that Jesus used. So, first point, therefore, it is one of the most characteristic features of Jesus' teaching. So the next thing we just need to explore is the recognition that parables aren't unique to Jesus. One of the things that people have this kind of real fascinating obsession with is uniqueness. It's only characteristic if it's unique to them. You will recognize it, I think, from descriptions about ministry. When people try and describe a bishop, they talk about what is unique to the ministry of bishop. When they talk about being a priest, they talk to what is unique to being a priest. The problem is once you get into deacons and lay readers, such as myself, is that we don't have stuff which is unique, and therefore kind of it undermines the definition of the ministry sometimes. And I think it's interesting when you have a look at Jesus and parables, is that people try and say, Jesus uniquely taught in parables. Well, no, he didn't. And it's important to recognize that. Parables can be found in all ancient cultures across the ancient world. It was how people taught within them. What is interesting, however, is Jesus' breadth of use of parables is bigger than anyone else's. What he does is how he uses them. It's that is striking and challenging. And this is where we get into the real problem of parables and how scholars over the years have really, really wrestled with this. And I'm going to say this more than once because it's the one thing I want to make sure that you take away when you're thinking about parables. The only thing that can be said about parables with any certainty is no one thing can be said about them all. And one of the reasons why this is very, very important is that people try and define parables. And they say, well, they're this. But in order to do that, you've got to lose a few in order to make this to be true. And you can feel the sideways steps that people are making in order to define the parables, in order to interpret the parables. If you want to say one thing clearly and certainly, you've got to lose a few in order to be able to say it. And that gets you, I think, into some fascinating territory, some questions about how Jesus plays with the understanding of parables. So let's have a quick look at Jesus' use of range in parables. They range from long, complex, allegorical type parables, such as the parable of the sower. And the allegory bit there is really important. So you say this bit is that, this is that. It's a one-to-one correlation. So this person is that person, this person is that person. The interesting thing about that, as we'll come on to when we have a look at the interpretation, is that that works beautifully for some parables. And actually it works best for the ones that Jesus did it with, the parable of the sower being the case in point. The problem is if you pick that up and then put it onto another parable, it doesn't quite work. You try doing an allegorical interpretation of the woman and the yeast. It's tricky because it doesn't fit, it doesn't work. So one of the things we need to be careful about is allowing the different parables to be different in their own right. So you've got long, complex, allegorical parables. You've got rich, those sparse narrative worlds. They're normally Luke's parables. Those kind of delicious stories that pull you into the world and don't give you enough details for anything. So, for example, the parable of the prodigal son. Did he have a mother? What did she think when the father split the inheritance? What happened actually to the older son while he was left behind? There's a whole load. Once you get into those rich, sparse worlds, there's just more and more questions you have no answer to. And that's what's beautiful about them. And interestingly, they're the ones that people most often love the most because you can answer your own questions in the sparse world provided by them. You also have snapshots, those little tiny snapshot parables. The kingdom of heaven is like fish, treasure, yeast, mustard seeds, those kind of things, where they're barely anything. They're just a couple of sentences and off you go. But what you will often forget is that actually Jesus uses other kind of parables as well, and we forget them because they're less easy to make sense of. That's the brief comparisons. The children sitting in the marketplace. When Jesus says, "What shall I compare you to?" To children sitting in the marketplace. Actually, that is also a parable, but he just does it in a slightly different way. So Jesus kind of ranges across all of these different types of parables. So when, therefore, we're beginning to explore what we think parables are, why they're important, what they give to us, we struggle because the range is so broad. So one of the things you might think was a sensible thing to do is actually to look at how Jesus uses the word parable, because that'll make it much more straightforward, won't it? Of course not. But let me show you, because I think this is quite interesting. So you have some parables. So what I'm about to do is give you a list of all the occasions where Jesus has used the word parable. You will notice that is unsatisfactory in all sorts of different ways. So the first are things that you would expect. So Matthew 13, that whole chapter of parables where he starts and ends with the word parable. So therefore we understand that everything inside chapter 13 is a parable. And so you've got the parable of the sower, the wheat and the weeds, the mustard seed, the woman, the yeast, the treasure in the field, fine pearl, fish and the nets. Lots of parables all kind of stuffed together in its parable chapter. He also uses the word parable for Matthew 21, which is the parable of the tenants in the vineyard. And it comes when the Pharisees work out that he's talking about them, and then they say they understood that the parable was about them. It comes for that very, very odd parable in Matthew 21, the wedding banquet. The one where they turn up in the wrong clothes and get chucked out, despite the fact they didn't know they were going to the banquet. That lovely, fair parable. That one is also called a parable. Then we have the statement, which we will come on to later in the talk, about those outside, the one that troubles everybody about parables. To those outside, everything will be in parables, but to those inside, everything will be explained, and we'll come on to that later. And then, so you might be thinking, oh, well, that's okay. I was expecting all of those, roughly, for parables. There's a googly, and the googly, I think, is a really interesting one. It comes in Mark 23. Where Mark says, he told them a parable. And then Jesus says, how can Satan cast out Satan? A house divided against itself cannot stand. And you go, well, that's not a parable because it's not a nice story. It doesn't compare anything. It doesn't fit into my category. At which point I like to remind you, the one thing that you can't say with any certainty everything about all the parables. It doesn't work. So recognizing that actually parable is a big and squishy term. It's a flexible term. It's used in all sorts of different ways. So when we're trying to work out what a parable is, what we need to do is kind of take them all the different kinds of parables, and lay them on alongside each other and see where we get to. So the next thing I just want to draw your attention to is the variety of images that Jesus uses. And the images are really interesting. We start with some that are absolutely everyday images, and these things you will be expecting. Parables that are about agriculture and farming, lots and lots of those. Parables about stuff you find in the house. Lots and lots of those. And so those are kind of everyday examples of how you live your life. And incidentally, again, we'll come back to this later. It's worth reminding ourselves that if you were somebody who lived in Galilee in the 1st century, and Jesus started talking about, when you go out to sow seed, they'd all go, yeah, we know what it's like when we go out to sow seed. One of the issues we have is Jesus says, when you go to sow seed, and we go, not so much, haven't done it recently. And one of the challenges is that Jesus is using everyday images all the time in his parables, and we struggle with it because it's not our experience. But then, having done a range of absolutely everyday events, he also does special events as his examples. So you've got stuff around society and relationships, weddings, banquets, kings and kingdoms, judges and judgments, those kind of way in which society functions together. And then you've also got money, either having it or not having it, and they come back again regularly in the parables. So Jesus has kind of various themes that he explores, some absolutely everyday, some more special circumstances. And incidentally, what I'm doing in laying all of this stuff out is I'm kind of laying it out for you, and then at the end we'll do a little, what can we learn from this when we're doing our own preaching? Which gets me nicely to one of the more difficult things I need to talk about. What is a parable? And one of the things that we need to recognize right at the start is that the range, Jesus' broad range of using parables, makes them almost impossible to define. And that's kind of the point that I'm trying to get through to you, really, is that Jesus uses parables in such different ways to try and achieve such different ends that it's actually really difficult even to try and define them. So some people define parables as illustration. And here I need to have a little rant. I hope you're ready. Sink down in your seats a little bit while I have my little New Testament scholars rant. The reason why people define parables as illustrations is because of the etymology of the word parable. So the word parabole, which is there up on the screen, comes from two Greek words, bole, which means to throw, and para, which means alongside. Therefore, a parable is something that you throw alongside. And for years and years and years, people had used that as the definition of a parable. Now, the problem with this is a little technical phrase, which I will tell you about, and then I'll tell you why it's problematic. James Barr, who always should be remembered in Oxford as one of the great Old Testament professors here, wrote a book called The Semantics of Biblical Languages in about the 80s. And kind of it is a slightly toe-curling, absolutely visceral attack on various things that lots of people do regularly. And I'm not in the James Barr category, but he wasn't completely wrong. And his problem in this particular instance is with what he calls etymological fallacies. And do you know what? The thing that preachers love more than anything else is an etymological fallacy. If you're ever preaching happily in your church and you suddenly hear someone shouting from the back row, etymological fallacy, it's me. There's an issue, and it's worth just noting the issue. And after I've noted the issue, you will all hate me forever, and that's absolutely fine. But the problem is that one of the things we love to do in preaching is we take a word, and one of the favorite words that people love to do this on is ecclesia. So the word ecclesia comes from two Greek words, ecclesia meaning called out, called, ek meaning out. So the word ecclesia means people who are called out, doesn't it? No. And this is the really important thing, because where a word comes from is not what it means. Where a word comes from is where a word comes from. And it's interesting to look at where the word comes from, but you can't then say, and now that's what it means. Let me illustrate it for you to give the idea. The word understand comes from two words. One of them is stand, the other one is under. So therefore, the word understand means to locate yourself under something, doesn't it? Well, no, not really. It might give you a little bit of a teensy-wincy bit of an insight into what the word understand means, but it's not what understand means. In the same way, ecclesia, called out, is not what the word means. You understand what a word means from how it's used in its context. So you can start with the etymology, but you can't say, and therefore this is what the word means. Rant over. But as a result, the word parable doesn't mean something that's thrown alongside. It came from something that was thrown alongside. The word parable means something else. The question is, what else? So let's have a look at them and see what we can learn from them. The first thing is that some parables are narratives, others are not narratives. Some parables are metaphors or similes. Some are much, much bigger, way bigger than any kind of concept of a metaphor or simile. And this is a really important one, which I think is very interesting. Some parables are very, very strange. And some parables are really clear about what they mean. And actually recognizing that is also, you know, when you see the lectionary coming up and you see one of those strange parables coming up and your heart sinks to your boots. There are some like that, but there's also some that are really easy to understand. And we mustn't have our heart sinks to our boot every time a parable comes up, because some of them are relatively straightforward. So how do we come up with a definition of the parables? You will know that I'm about to say this. Oh, hang on. Oh, no, I'm not. Sorry, I was on the wrong slide. I was on completely the wrong slide. Don't worry about that. I'm not going to say that at all. So a few definitions. One of the interesting things is seeing New Testament scholars bend themselves out of shape in order to try and work out precisely how you define a parable. I've got a few that I just think are tantalizing and fascinating and will help you do your own thinking about what you think a parable is. There is somebody who's written an utterly brilliant book on the parables, and if you buy only one book on the parables, Christine won't want me to tell you this, don't buy mine, buy Klein Snodgrass's. Apart from anything else, he's got the best name in the world, Klein Snodgrass. And his book is called Stories of Intent. It's absolutely superb treatment, really, really big, fat book on the parables. And Snodgrass says, oh, hang on, I've got out of date. Where am I? There I am. Snodgrass suggests that we think of parables as imaginary gardens with real toads in them. And it's just a lovely, lovely image. Parables, some of them, not all of them, but a lot of parables are fantasies. They are completely made up. But one of the things that you will often find in most, not all parables, is there's some actual real stuff in there, something that you recognize as the real toad. You know, that thing that disrupts, that kind of... So things like the prodigal son, think about the prodigal son as an imaginary garden with a real toad in it. And it begins to make sense. It kind of gives you that sense of what he's talking about. Another possibility is by someone called David Stern, an elusive narrative. And you'll see the problem with that, because not all of them are narratives, but an elusive narrative which is told for an ulterior purpose. There's a reason why you're telling the story, and you want people to try and get to them. The problem with that is that some parables have a clear ulterior purpose. Other parables, guess what, don't have a clear ulterior purpose. They kind of hang in an oddly surprising way. One of my favourite definitions comes from Søren Kierkegaard, who says, "A parable is an indirect communication which deceives the hearer into truth." It's wonderful. It's really fabulous. And the reason why I love it is that being deceived into truth seems to me to lie at the heart of a lot of what Jesus is doing. He doesn't kind of come at you full frontal and say, what you absolutely must think about the kingdom of God is. If only for those of us who have to write essays on the kingdom of God, he did, but he never did. Instead, what he says is the kingdom of God is like yeast, mustard seed, fish, net. Off you go and work it out. But there is something about that indirect communication which kind of deceives you, trips you into truth, and all of a sudden you find yourself in truth unawares. The rabbis, fascinatingly, called their parables, which in Hebrew are called mashal, as handles for understanding Torah. So they saw parables as the way in which you would have a handle and then you would go to Torah and then you would kind of understand it more because you had a means by which you could get into the truth of what Torah was talking about. You'll get the idea that we could go on with this all day. I could give you endless possibilities and you'd go, yes, oh, doesn't quite work. Oh, yeah, maybe. Oh, no, it doesn't work for all of them. But that gives you the idea about the parables, is they defy definition. Almost impossible to be able to say a parable is, always, in every case. It can't be done. Instead, parables tantalize us. They tickle us. They leave us discomforted, kind of trying to work out where it is that we're going. So let me give you a few things that I've observed about the parables in the work that I've done. And I think all of these, for me, are fascinating as we think about how we go about preaching. Parables are visual, not conceptual. I am a massive visual thinker, so it's probably why I love the parables quite so much. I had a colleague when I taught at one of the colleges I taught at who was a conceptual thinker, and he would chuck out these word pictures, which for him were just word pictures, and I would sit there going, oh, I've got to imagine that now, and the image of it would stay with me for the whole of the morning, whereas for him, he was just a concept person, and he just put a whole random selection of words together, and it worked for him. So there's something about the visualness. Think about Jesus' parables, and there's a very high chance that many of you will have a picture in your mind. If I say to you, the Good Samaritan, you've got a picture now in your mind of something that happened. Or if I say to you, the parable of the sower, again, you've got a picture comes into your mind, which is why I would argue that the John's I am sayings fit best with the parables, because Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, and into your head comes a picture. And therefore, for me, there's something about the visualness of them which is really important. They are elusive, not concrete. The thing about the parables, most of them, not all of them, but most of the parables, is that they tickle the truth. They don't land you with a big conceptual, propositional truth on your lap. What they do is they kind of suggest to you that you might like to think in this direction, or maybe in that direction, or you could maybe think over there. And it's the elusiveness about them which I think is fascinating. They are based in real life, not entirely fantasy, but you will get some fantasy elements in them. The most important thing about parables, which you already know, they're profoundly hard to tie down, profoundly hard to say, and this is what this means, except for when it's easier to say that this is what this means, and then you can do it, because not all parables are the same. And then, really, really interesting, they leave loose ends hanging. One of the things I would love to have asked Jesus is, did you mean us to interpret the parables in a clear and very easily understandable way? If the answer is yes, you should have given us a few more clues. Because, as you will know, for 2,000 years of history, with those that are not the allegorical parables, we've spent ages working out, did he mean this, or did he mean that, or did he mean this, or did he mean that? And I would say that's the point. And there is something in that which is really interesting for us to reflect on when we're thinking about preaching. So now let us turn our attention to we've done definition, a very clear and understandable definition of parables we've achieved, not. And now we're going to have a look at interpretation, interpreting the parables. And this is where you get into real turf wars in New Testament scholarship. So anything I'm about to say, you will find somebody who disagrees with. So don't worry about it, but recognize that interpreting the parables is really, really complex. So let's have a look at some issues interpreting the parables, and I've referred to one of these already. Should you interpret the parables as though they are allegories, one-to-one correlation? This person is that person, this person is that person, on you go, like with the parable of the sower. Or should you interpret them as open-end, elusive images? Now, for me, the fascinating thing is I could bring you a New Testament scholar, a live one, stand him on the stage and say, this person thinks you should interpret all parables allegorically. Can't say that word. I could also bring you a live New Testament scholar, stand him on that stage there, who would also say you should never interpret the parables allegorically. They're always elusive, open-ended narratives. And then I would get them to talk to each other for hours on end until you didn't care anymore. But the really, really interesting thing is, back to this point that I have been making, is the only thing you can say about parables is that no one thing can be said. So actually, your allegorical person is right. Your open-end elusive person is right, because you can find different kinds of parables. The fascinating thing is how easily we slip into making some of the parables allegorical, and whether we're right to do it or not. I've been debating ever since I started writing this whether I'm going to really upset you or not, and I've decided I will. So the thing that is guaranteed to light people's fires more than any other thing that you can say about the parables is the prodigal son's father might not be God. Oh, can you feel it? Can you feel it? I did this at a couple of clergy conferences, nearly died. But let me just tell you something about the prodigal son parable, which I think is really, really interesting. And then you'll begin to see how we kind of slip into making them allegorical. The thing about the prodigal son and the story is that actually the father is a pretty bad father. Everything in rabbinic law says, whatever you do, do not split your inheritance before you die, because if you do, you will destroy your family. Prodigal son. Then, having split your inheritance, the other reason why you shouldn't split your inheritance before you die is having done it, it then belongs to your sons and not to you anymore. So having split it before you die, you then have given them the money. So prodigal son goes off, spends all his money, comes back, the father sacrifices the calf, which now belongs to the older son, without telling the older son that he's sacrificing his own calf, and doesn't even invite him to the party. I would submit to you gently that that's not really who God is. But if I say that, then you'll get really upset with me, because of course we have so much interpreted the prodigal son in the way that we have that we're absolutely fixed. My own interpretation of the prodigal son is, if in this absolutely dysfunctional human family a father can behave like this, how much more so will your heavenly Father behave? So I'm saying it's not that there's nothing to do with God in it at all, but what if God isn't in them? And then you start going through the other parables and going, well, what if God's not in that one? And what if God's not in that one? And the other fascinating one, then I will stop because I could talk about this for hours. The parable just before the prodigal son in Luke 15, coming up on Sunday, is absolutely fascinating. And if you read traditional interpretations, hysterical, really. So you've got three. The parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, the parable of the lost son. Parable of the lost sheep, is the shepherd God? Yes. Parable of the lost son, is the father God? Yes. Parable of the lost coin, is the woman God? No, just a woman. And it's really, really interesting, isn't it? And in that, you realise that we are seduced in our interpretation of the parables into ways that other people have decided we should interpret them. And for me, one of the most important things we need to bear in mind is that Jesus left them hanging for a reason. And if you come to a parable and you know, I know exactly what this parable is about, you probably don't. And this is, for me, one of the next things to say about interpreting the parables. The thing about parables, which makes them close to metaphors, is that I would say most, not all parables, to continue my theme, but most parables are meant to make you go, what? The kingdom of heaven is like, really? And our difficulty is that we come along and I say to you, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast. And you go, yeah, of course it is. I knew that all along. And at that point, the parables died. Because actually what you're meant to be able to do is go, but yeast is toxic. It's compared, the yeast of the Pharisees is compared to something really evil. How can you say the kingdom of heaven is like yeast? Go away, think about it. And there is something I think actually really quite important about recognizing that we struggle with parables because they have died for us, because we know what they mean. Another issue, which I've alluded to already, is the challenge of understanding the world of Jesus means that actually we often miss some of the points of the parables. And one of my favourite examples of this comes from Kenneth Bailey. In Sunday school, the parable of the wise man and the foolish man, and all your pictures are the wise man's built his house on the top of the cliff, and the foolish man's built his house on the beach. And you go, you should have recognised that this wasn't going to go well. But of course, actually, in Jesus' world, that wasn't what it was like at all. In Jesus' world, if you live in desert territory, what happens is, in the middle of the summer, the ground bakes solid so that it looks the same as the ground that's got rocks underneath it. You cannot tell until the rains come. Think the parable. When the rains come, the ground that was sand, but has been baked solid in the sun, turns back into what it always was, sand. The ground that was rocky stays as it was because it's rocky. And so therefore, it's that kind of understanding that kind of world is something that we really struggle with, I think, in understanding Jesus' parables. I think we also struggle with leaving loose ends hanging. That Jesus didn't try and tie it down. He didn't say, now let me sit you down and explain exactly what this precise parable means. He did sometimes, but he didn't at other times. And that gives us, of course, what I alluded to at the start, the challenge of preaching on them. How do you preach on a parable in a way that doesn't kill it? That doesn't kind of ossify it, that doesn't kind of make it any longer tantalizing. I haven't got an answer for you. If I had, I'd have probably started with it. But there is, I think, something just to kind of have in your mind every time you preach on a parable. Am I killing it a little bit more? Or am I making it more elusive, more tantalizing, more loose-endish? Because if you are tying it down in a way that the text doesn't appear to support, then the challenge is that you probably are killing it a little bit. And then quickly, before I get on to the lessons that I've learned, that passage. I'm going to mention it now because otherwise you'll ask me it in the questions. You know the one I mean, don't you? When he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. And he said to them, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that they may indeed look but not perceive, may indeed listen but not understand, so they may not turn again and be forgiven." And he said to them, "Do you not understand this parable? Then how will you understand all the parables?" To which we go, great question. Could you give us a hint? Of course, he then does, because he then does an interpretation of the parable of the sower. But this is the passage that really upsets lots and lots of people, because surely communication about the kingdom, isn't it about getting people to see and understand and know? Isn't it? And for me, one of the really interesting questions is, is it? Actually, does Jesus in fact say to us that the purpose of the parables is to dumbfound you a little bit, to get you to scratch your head, to say, I don't really know what's going on? It's one of those kind of really striking things. Actually, is the purpose of a parable to make you go, I have no idea what you're talking about, but you've caught my attention, and now I'm going to go away and think about it a little bit more. Of course, the beauty of this particular bit in Mark's Gospel is Mark sets up gloriously. You've got the insiders, the disciples. You've got the outsiders, the ones who get the parables. So we know, fabulously, from Mark 4 onwards, the disciples are going to understand everything, unlike the outsiders who don't understand a thing. Until you get to the beautiful moment in Mark 8 when they're in the boat and Jesus says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, and they go, he's talking about bread again, and they haven't understood it. And Jesus says exactly these words to them. Do you look and not perceive? Do you hear and not understand? And all of a sudden you realize that the insiders have become the outsiders, as opposed to the outsiders in Mark 4-8, who are all insiders. At which point Mark has started to mess with your minds and you need to go and lie down a little bit. But I think there is something really striking about that whole question of, should you be getting people to understand? Is that what the parables are about? So, what can we learn from the parables in our own preaching? Variety. I think for me, if I learn one thing from the parables about preaching, it's about the fact you cannot say one thing about all the parables. Jesus mixed it up. He sometimes told a long story. He sometimes told a short story. He sometimes had an image. He sometimes had a phrase. He didn't do the same thing all the time. And that upsets us as preachers, doesn't it? Because actually, we love to have a little formula. And our little formula goes, entertaining story, think about the passage, life application, job's a good one. It works. It's kind of, and when I'm going, I have no idea what I'm going to do, I do my little formula and life is happy. But Jesus didn't. And it raises us the question of whether we should be as using variety as much as Jesus did. Actually, what would it be like if you mixed it up a little bit more, told a long story, told a tiny story, kind of made a statement, asked some questions? Actually, what would the variety be like in our preaching? Is there something to be learned from that? There's also something really, really, really important about the significance of story and image, of how our stories capture people. This great book I was telling you about has this really, really brilliant quotation, which I love. Apart from personal experience, stories are the quickest way to learning. We learn most easily in the concrete, but because we cannot easily remember hundreds of concrete accounts, our brains store most easily in the abstract. In teaching and preaching, the shortcut is to repeat the abstract idea we already know, forgetting that others need to learn it in the concrete. I kind of want to go, discuss, because it's a really, really interesting idea. But I think there's something in that to explore. Did you learn the facts that you know as a list of facts? Some of you will go, yeah, I love a list of facts. There's nothing that makes me happier. But actually, there will be a lot of people who actually learn what they know through stories. And in preaching, we don't give it back to them in stories. We give them back to them in a list of facts. So the question is, how do we kind of get back into getting people to understand, to do their learning through stories? How do stories function in our sermons? What else can we learn? We can also learn the importance of using everyday analogies. Jesus and his absolutely kind of on the ground yeast and seeds and fish, things that people knew every day. What would it be like next time you preach on a parable if you translated it into an everyday image that would work today? And what would that feel like for people? Would it make sense to them? Would it cause problems? Do we, I know the answer to that for me, but to you, have the confidence to leave threads hanging and allow people to make of your sermon what they will? You do know they do anyway, don't you? that awful moment when you're standing at the door and somebody said, "Oh, I loved it when you said," and you go, "I never said that." Because they do. But actually, what if we allowed more of the threads to hang? What if we were able not to tie things down quite so much? What would it be like? What would it feel like for us? And the thing I'm really conscious of is I would feel really anxious about doing that. But actually, all the evidence we've got from the Gospels is that's exactly what Jesus did. So what would it be like if we had a bit more confidence to do that? And then the final thing, which I think is worth just reminding ourselves of time and time again. Even the disciples didn't know what Jesus was talking about. So if at the end of your most spectacular sermon series, in which you have laid out everything that everyone needs to know, there's one person in your congregation who hasn't understood it all, it's okay. Don't worry. And there is something I think actually really quite interesting about the slow act of preaching. It's something that I wrote in the afterword for the book that Christine mentioned. For me, preaching is the ultimate slow food. It drops and then it grows. And actually, the sermons that I remember most vividly are probably the ones from 5 years ago, where something was said, a seed was planted, and then I go back to it, and I go back to it, and I go back to it. There's something about having the confidence for your sermons not to be quick food. They can be slow food. They can grow and develop in their own way. So I think there is lots and lots and lots to be learnt from the parables for understanding how we do preaching. And the most striking thing of all, I think, is that actually it undermines most of the things that we are taught about what makes good preaching. And one of the things we need to do is sit with the discomfort of that and say, we know this isn't how preaching is ought to be, but it's apparently what Jesus did, and maybe we feel a little bit more confident just to sit with that and allow it to be as it is. So we've now got 10 minutes for questions, and the rules for the questions remain the same as they were for Brian. Short-winded is much better than long-winded. If you can, we've got 2 microphones traversing the room. There's one over there and there's one over there. And if you can be stacking yourselves up for the questions, and we'll crack on through as many as we can. The only thing that's slightly different is it's just possible we might have some questions from Facebook Live. Ooh. And if they do, now is your moment, if you're watching on Facebook Live, to send in your questions, and we'll pop them in as well. Who's got the questions coming in if they're coming in? Yeah, over there. Right, so I will notice a hand waving over there if there's questions come in as well. So then, where are we going to go for questions? Lovely.
My name is Robert. If a parable is ambiguous, if there are a number of possible interpretations, is it legitimate to preach one interpretation in one sermon, and then when it comes up again 3 years later, to preach a different interpretation?
I would say, yeah. And see if anyone notices. That would be the key thing. But I think for me, one of the really interesting things is allow the parables to play in you and in the congregation. And is there a way in which you can even trail it? And I mean, one of the things I've done occasionally for some of the very short parables is to preach 3 different interpretations in the same sermon. People find it quite difficult, and then you need to have a time for questions and conversation afterwards. But I think there is something about allowing people to recognize that parables, and that's the stuff about kind of being kind of tripped into truth or deceived into truth, is that actually it's not that the parables mean, this parable means this, but the parable means in me, and so the me that is different when I read it the next time is actually going to produce a different interpretation. So I think there's some interesting things, but it's about having confidence again in allowing them to be as they are. Where are we for our next? Hi.
I am not a preacher where I preach every Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And
Me neither. It's lovely, isn't it?
It's really nice. But so at the previous church I was at, I did this, and I think I didn't mean to, but I would leave my sermons, and I would have questions at the end, and they would be open, and I don't know, that's just how it went. And after one Sunday, a member came up and said, "Can you please not ask questions anymore at the end?" Because they were getting tired of not having an answer. So, and this was only maybe once a month, and I thought, oh my gosh, do I do that every time? But what does that exhaust people, though? I mean, I did then consciously think about it later.
Yes, it does, is the first answer. Should it, is the other question. And I think it's, in a way, I'm kind of back to where what Brian was saying. So I'm looking over there, it's not there anymore, it's somewhere else. But back to what Brian was saying about, isn't it okay to disrupt people and maybe alienate them a little bit and leave them a little bit uncomfortable? The thing that people most love above everything else is for you to tell them, this is what it means. It only means this. It's very, very clear. You don't have to think about it. I've told you the answer. And they go, oh, thank you very much, and off they go very happy. The problem is they shouldn't really be reading the Bible if they want that, because actually the Bible doesn't deliver that in that kind of way. Don't hear me saying it doesn't deliver truth. Of course it does, but actually it makes us work really hard to be able to be deceived into truth. And I think there is something about the culture of our churches which we need to stop and think about quite carefully, is that if people only want a nice, clear answer, are we good with just of kind of going with that? And I would say, no, we probably shouldn't be. So what I'm trying to say to you is, carry on. Even if it annoys them, carry on. Where are we? Over here.
My name is Edmund Marshall, reader in the Diocese of St Albans. One definition of a parable which I've always found helpful is that it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And the point of the parable is where the unexpected element in the parable meets the heavenly dimension. Does that fit with your analysis?
Yes-ish. It's Charlie Moule is that quotation. I absolutely love it. It is an earthly story. I think where I hesitate is that kind of contrast between heaven and earth. I think I would want to say it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning and a heavenly story with an earthly meaning. Because I think one of the things that you've got, because the whole point about a parable is you live it. You're not just meant to kind of go away and think fine thoughts about it. It's actually meant to change who you are, how you act, what you do in the world. And I think there is something quite important about not just leaving it as an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, back to what Brian was saying earlier, but actually saying it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning that has an impact on how I live my life in an earthly way. So I would want to kind of circle it round. So yes-ish is the answer. Where are we now?
Discomfort and disruption. Are there any ethics around storytelling, types of stories you don't think are helpful? Yes.
Unfortunately, Jesus told most of them. I think the discomfort is we need to be very, very careful, and that's what you're alluding to, aren't you, about how you take people out of their comfort zones in such a way as they can cope. I have been in contexts where people have done storytelling, which I felt has been irresponsible, because it hasn't given people a safety net, a kind of a recognition that actually it's all right. And I think it's so do we need to add in the word pastoral discomforting in the telling of the stories, so that actually we discomfort people to the extent that they can deal with it? Of course, the problem is, as I discovered when I was doing my cheery little, Luke 15, the prodigal son's father isn't God, is that what different people can deal with is different in a different context. So actually, I thought I was, I did it at a clergy conference, I assumed I was in safe hands, but actually I really deeply upset some people. And I'm really sorry that I did, because I didn't want to do that. So how do you kind of tell stories in such a way that actually takes people to a challenging place, but isn't too challenging? And I think the answer to that is making sure we talk a lot to people afterwards, and making, and learning from what it is that we've learned from that, I think.
Paula, you've indicated that the parables may be open-ended. Is there any evidence that the gospel writers themselves tries to close up some of those loose ends, whether that perhaps happened in the oral tradition, which the evangelist then wrote down?
It's a great question, and of course the answer is who knows. So there are some people, biblical scholar who was standing here who likes all the parables to be elusive and open-ended would say, well, actually, it wasn't Jesus who gave the interpretation. It was Mark or Matthew or Q or you name it, whoever it was that did it. I find it very difficult. I always find scholarly explanations that get you off a hook are something I don't trust. So because I am a elusive, open-ended person, you will have gathered, and therefore I would really like Jesus not to have interpreted the parable of the sower, because then all the parables would be uninterpreted, and then I would be happier. But I kind of feel the need to stay on the hook, that actually maybe Jesus did interpret some of them, and maybe he did intend us to do some allegorically. But what we can't know is what happened in the afterlife of the parables, how the gospel writers put it down, how they began to kind of explore it. Except for, I think it is worth noting that probably, I know none of you have ever done this, but I think Jesus might have told his stories more than once. Nobody else would have done it. But for example, the parable of the lost sheep, look at it in Matthew, look at it in Luke, it means something different in Matthew and Luke. In Matthew, it's about being lost from the church. In Luke, it's about the losing and finding in the whole of that kind of strand of that particular chapter. So it means it's located differently in Matthew and Luke, and therefore has a different meaning because of its context. Who did that? I would say probably Jesus. I think he probably told a story with this, and then he told it again with that, and we've got different versions. It might have been Matthew, it might have been Luke. It's very hard to know. So that's a really unsatisfactory answer. Who knows? But interesting, very nevertheless interesting. Shall we have one more and then we'll close?
Hi, I suspect I've probably killed the odd parable or two. Any top tips for CPR or resurrection?
Brilliant question. Lovely last question. I would say making them unfamiliar again. That's the way. Because the way parables die is where you hear it, you go, yeah, I know exactly what that's about, and then you switch off, you don't do the wrestling. So is there a way in which we can bring them back to life by making them unfamiliar, just a kind of bit odd? And there are different ways you could do that. You can either do it by translating it into a modern day, everyday scenario, which might kind of give it new life. Other ways is to look at unusual interpretations of the parable. Some of you will know that one of my favourite of these is the parable of the mustard seed. And now a lot of scholars would argue that the mustard seed actually is a pernicious weed. And it was well known by Pliny the Elder in the 1st century. So when Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, he's saying the kingdom of heaven is like a pernicious weed. Once you sow it, you'll never get rid of it. And then it grows into a great whacking tree that attracts all the birds into your wheat field. You really don't want it. That's what the kingdom of heaven's like. And the reason I like it is it kind of makes you go, really? And then I think you're back into the old territory of parables making you jump. So it's can you make a parable kind of strange again? And if you can re-strange the parable, then you've given it CPR, I think. Thank you.